So, one of the readings that we are dealing with this week is Federalist 10. This is by far the most read Federalist paper of them all. And I used to have it at the beginning of the semester, and I moved it to be here with parties because it comes up again here. And I kind of wish, just for our sake this semester, with everything that has happened, we had at least talked about it earlier, but here we are. Factions, according to Madison, who writes Federalist 10, and I want to make sure I'm giving you the correct definition, so I'm checking my notes over here. Factions are a number of people who are united by some common impulse. A number of people who are united by some common impulse. And that language is very important, right? So, number of people, yeah, okay, great. Group of people. United by some common impulse. Impulse is not something that's thought out, it's not something that's reasoned, it's something that is visceral and raw. And I'm going to get together with these people and we're going to grab our pitchforks and torches and storm the castle, right? That's what a faction is. And that is what Madison and the founders were concerned with when they were dealing with how to write a constitution that could span all of these colonies, now states, and not kind of be interrupted by all the uprisings that were happening at the time with all of the rebellions. Factions create instability, and you don't want instability because then a country like Britain or France or Spain can come in and take you over. They also create injustice, confusion. No one knows where things are coming from. So factions are bad. We don't want them. They are not thought out. They are not representative of good practice in government. So Madison talks about three problems that are created by factions. The first is that there is an unstable government. Unstable government. The second is that the public good is disregarded because of fighting parties. So you have these factions that are just going at it, and everybody's ignoring the types of things that need to get done, right? And the third is that what ends up happening is that things are decided by an overbearing majority. Whoever has the most people wins, and that might not be in the common good. It's one way to solve disputes, but it might not be the best way because there might be a minority of people who have a really good idea about something, or at least should not be ignored totally. So those are the three problems with factions. The two causes of factions, Madison says. One is, he says, man's zeal for differences in opinion and allegiance to various leaders, right? So we're just never going to agree on everything. You've been a person long enough to know that this is true. You get 5 people in the room and try and order a pizza, and good luck, right? Which is why when we have events at school, we just get some cheese and some pepperoni and call it a day. So that's one thing. It's just people like to be different. People have different opinions. That's how things happen. The second cause of factions is that, and he says this is the most common, there is an inequality in the distribution of wealth. Not everybody has the same amount of money, the same amount of property, the same amount of things. Now, Madison isn't turning into a socialist here to say we should redistribute that, but he is saying that that is a cause for a lot of disagreement amongst people. And so as long as we have that situation, we are going to have factions. So, those two things seem like problems that are not going to go away just because we write a constitution down. He does say, though, and this is very important, a pure democracy where we all get a say on every single thing that happens, as opposed to having representatives, that doesn't work. It actually creates factions rather than gets rid of them. Only a republic can actually deal with factions. So he says we can try and cure the evils of factions, and we can try this with 2 ways. One is we remove the causes. We destroy liberty, or we make everyone think alike. Well, making everyone think alike is not possible. And destroying liberty is not a good idea. It kind of goes against the whole principle of doing this. He says it's like eliminating fire or eliminating oxygen in order to put out a fire. And you're successful, but at what cost? So that's not going to work. You cannot make everyone think alike, and destroying liberty is just going against everything that we're trying to do here. So he says then, if you can't cure the evils of factions by removing the causes, you're going to have to control the effects, right? So there are two different ways to think about this. One is if it's a minority faction, if the majority of the people are not in the faction, they're not acting impulsively, the best way to deal with that is majority rule, right? You just vote them down. You take care of it that way at the ballot box or in Congress or whatever the case might be, and you move on. That's one way. But what if out of 100 people, 80 people are in the faction, and they're the ones who are acting impulsively? Well, he says this is the problem, right? It's not the minority ones that are going to cause us the biggest headache, it's the majority ones. He says only a republic, not a pure democracy, only a republic can control this type of faction. Two ways that it does it. One is that once you have a large number of citizens and representatives, first of all, once you have a large number of citizens, you're going to have a lot of people with a lot of different thoughts, and it's going to be harder for people to find, a cohesive group that can be a threat when everybody thinks differently. But when you have to refine those ideas up through representatives, right? If I want something to change in government, I need to contact my representative and tell them, hey, this is what I want you to do. And then they think about it and say, she's a little crazy, or hey, maybe this is a good idea, especially if they're hearing more people say, this is what we want you to do, and then they act on it. So Madison is saying there's a refining mechanism here. The second thing, which doesn't work as well today, is that if you extend people over a large territory, it's harder for them to get together and cause trouble, essentially. To cause factions, being the trouble here. Now, when we have the kind of technology we have today, that does not seem to be as fruitful of a purpose as the other one. Now, it's true, it's harder to get together if someone is across the country than if they are down the street. And if they're across the country, it might be harder for me to find common ground with them to begin with. So there is still a point there. But the way in which people can connect these days makes it so that this is a little less persuasive than maybe it used to be. Now, Federalist 10 is cited for a lot of things, but it is often cited as, hey, the founders didn't want political parties, and political parties are evil and bad and yada, yada, yada. Now, that's not entirely false. The founders of the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, rather, really did not foresee political parties as part of this system, and they were trying to get rid of factions. That said, that doesn't mean that political parties are necessarily factions. Why? Well, political parties act in a very methodical way. They aren't acting on impulse. They are supposed to be acting by thinking things through and refining public opinion so that elected officials can then say, this is the pulse of the nation, this is what we should do. The problem then happens when that doesn't occur. In 1950, the American Political Science Association wrote essentially a report called Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System. And the report was supposed to be, hey, we need to shape up our acts right now, because if we have a two-party system, which we did then and we do now, then we have to make it work for the people, because there are very big dangers if we just let things be and kind of devolve into a messier situation. So this reading shows us that the role of parties is to refine public attitudes. So remember, I'm calling up my representative and I'm saying, I want you to do something right now. And the representative hears the people, takes some of the suggestions, and then finds that some of them maybe aren't worthwhile. So parties can do that too. They can kind of take the pulse of the people and say, hey, this is what is important to this group of people, and to the greater good. They can also advocate for certain policies, which is important, right? We want people to do the work necessary to understand how policies work, how policies are made, and what will happen if we enact certain policies. And then they are the way in which we effectuate representation. This is how we make representation happen. I decide to vote for someone both because they are, of a certain political party, and because I have listened to them and find that they are competent. Political parties aid in that by providing a platform and issue stances. So that is the role of the parties. And the APSA says the two-party system should do two very important things. If it's going to exist and only be two parties, let it at least do these two things. The first is that they should introduce policy programs. Tell us what ways we can solve policies and at least advocate for those ways so that members of Congress and the president and members of state legislatures can actually debate those. And the second is that when they win elections, they need to, and this means legislators, not governors, not presidents, they need to be able to effectuate such programs. So if we all go and vote for the Democrats because they promised free college, they better be able to deliver on free college. The danger is when the two-party system isn't there as kind of a balancing act of how to figure out ideas and proposals, but rather just kind of is the norm and doesn't really act the way it should. They say that there are 4 problems. The first is that good programs are going to fail. If good programs are proposed, but you cannot garner public support behind them because you're too busy fighting, then that's going to lead to a failure, right? The second thing is that people will shift responsibility to the president if they see that the parties cannot work things out in the legislature. And we have certainly seen that over time. The power of the presidency has grown significantly over the course of our country's history, but probably, since you can say certainly since the Civil War, but in the 20th century and certainly the 21st, it just continues to grow. The third thing is that the two parties that are left will not be respected, and they will kind of disintegrate under their own power. Now, I wouldn't say that they have disintegrated, but I sure would say that people don't respect the parties, at least not outright the way that they used to. They're not thought of as being good. In fact, that's why so many people want to claim that they're independents. The fourth thing is that it will lead to a rise in extremism on both sides. Because the two parties will seem incapable of working for the greater good and being able to produce meaningful action in programs that are relevant to people, extremists will come about and take advantage of the situation and ignore the public good to get one very extreme version of something enacted or passed. That is what the APSA is worried about, that we're going to disintegrate the role of Congress, that the parties are going to be looked down upon, that the good programs will fail, and that extremists will rise to take over. Now, I will leave up to you to think about whether the APSA had a point in all of this or not. All right, finally, our last reading is by IED, and it's called Make Debate Great Again, How Bad Political Argument is Undermining Democracy. And in a perfect world, we would have actually been having some debate in class and talking about this, but let me give you kind of the summary of what this is talking about. Now, even though this is about Canada, it does apply equally to the U.S. The author is talking to various political scientists and talking about how our political debates have just become bad. They're not helpful, and they're actually harmful because they are showing just complete extremism in views. People aren't willing to listen to the other side. And social media creates echo chambers so that we only hear what we want to hear, and we aren't exposed to other ideas or having to confront other realities. So there are some political scientists, and we'll have an article coming up, I think next week, if not the week after, talking about how we could have fairer debates. And one of the ways in which we might be doing a bad job at this is we're overdoing democracy. People are choosing their friends based on their political leanings. People are choosing where they live based on their political leanings. We make social choices based on this. Now, this means that we then, again, shut ourselves off to other ideas and don't have to articulate a good reason for the way we feel about certain things. Now, there's not much left in terms of a good prescription for what to do next, but there are some suggestions that we should have civil debates where we actually, and I know this sounds very trite because it's like, well, of course, we should just be good. But we have to actually hear other people, and we have to actually care about the logic of our own arguments and the logic of their arguments. Not just waiting for our turn to speak, but actually listening to what they are saying so that they can be heard. That is important, and a good takeaway from this article.